On a storm-lashed Chicago night, Evelyn Cross quietly steps out of the most heavily guarded mansion in the city, carrying only a suitcase, a fake identity, and a secret that could collapse the entire Vale empire. The storm outside Dominic Vale's estate was not just weather. It felt like a warning pressing against the walls of a life built on control, fear, and wealth. Inside the mansion, everything was polished, silent, and heavily monitored. Guards stood at every corridor. Cameras watched every movement, and even silence felt expensive. Evelyn Cross moved through that silence like a shadow that had finally decided to escape the light. She had once believed this place was her salvation. Dominic Vale had not appeared to her as a monster at first. He had been composed, powerful, and strangely protective in a world that always demanded something in return. But power always revealed its second face. Dominic Vale was not simply a man. He was an empire wrapped in human skin. His name made politicians adjust their tone. His enemies spoke it like a curse. His allies obeyed it like law. But Evelyn had seen the version of him no one else was allowed to witness. The man who struggled to separate love from ownership. That was why leaving him hurt more than fear itself. The emotional truth she carried that night was heavier than her suitcase. Evelyn was pregnant, and the knowledge had not brought joy alone. It had brought clarity. In Dominic's world, children were never just children. They were leverage, protection, threats, and legacy. She could not allow her unborn child to become currency in an empire built on violence. She remembered the night that changed everything. A warning had arrived at the mansion. A box filled with blood-stained roses, placed silently at the gates. No message was needed. It was a reminder that loving Dominic Vale meant living beside death without ever hearing it approach. That memory followed her every step as she prepared to disappear. Evelyn did not tell Dominic about the pregnancy because she understood him too well. Even if he loved the child, love would not equal freedom. He would surround her with guards, isolate her from the world, and call it protection. To him, safety and captivity often looked identical. Her escape was precise and silent. She disabled her phone, leaving behind a digital ghost. She avoided the main hallways where guards rotated like clockwork. She moved to the servants' corridor, a space no one paid attention to because no one believed something valuable would ever leave through it. Each step felt like tearing herself away from a life that looked perfect on the outside, but felt like a golden cage from within. On the table in their bedroom, she left behind a diamond ring that no longer felt like love, and a handwritten note that explained nothing because explanation would have meant hesitation. Outside the mansion, the air felt different. Colder, freer, and more uncertain. She reached the bus station beyond the city lights, her hand instinctively resting on her stomach for the first time as if acknowledging a life she now had to protect alone. In that moment, she silently promised her unborn child a future untouched by violence. As the bus arrived, she stepped forward without looking back, while inside the mansion Dominic Vale entered their bedroom, expecting silence to be normal, only to find the empty ring box and a hidden truth beneath the pillow that changed everything forever. Dominic slowly lifted the object from beneath the pillow, realizing it was a positive pregnancy test. And for the first time in his life, control slipped completely out of his hands. The silence inside Dominic Vale's mansion was heavier than any gunfire his men had ever heard. The most feared Mafia don in Chicago did not react the way people expected. There was no shouting, no immediate violence, no shattered objects. Instead, there was stillness, sharp, controlled, and deeply unnatural. Dominic stood in the center of his bedroom, staring at the empty space Evelyn Cross had left behind. The bed was untouched on her side. The ring box lay open. The air still carried a faint trace of her presence, as if the room itself refused to accept she was gone. When his hand finally reached beneath the pillow, everything changed. The pregnancy test was small, ordinary, almost insignificant in appearance, but the meaning behind it was explosive. In that instant, Dominic understood why Evelyn had disappeared without warning. She had not simply left him. She had escaped from a future she believed would trap her forever. The realization struck deeper than betrayal. Betrayal could be punished. This was something else. It was fear. Evelyn had not feared his enemies, his empire, or his violence. She had feared what he would become once he knew the truth. For the first time in years, Dominic Vale did not issue a command. His men waited outside the door, expecting rage. They were trained for chaos, for blood, for the kind of punishment that usually followed defiance. But the door remained closed and no orders came. That silence unsettled them more than any explosion of violence could have. Inside the room, Dominic slowly moved through Evelyn's belongings. Every object told a fragment of a decision made long before she left. A drawer slightly reorganized. A hidden cash stash missing. A subtle shift in patterns only someone who knew her deeply would notice. He was not just angry. He was calculating. And beneath that calculation was something he refused to name. Roman Slade entered later, cautious but steady, suggesting what others were already whispering. That Evelyn might have been taken by rivals. That someone from the outside had struck first. But Dominic rejected it without hesitation. Nothing about her disappearance felt forced. It was planned, precise, personal. That detail made it worse. Outside those walls, the empire was already shifting. The Moretti family had been circling for months, waiting for weakness. Federal pressure was tightening around Dominic's operations. And somewhere within his own structure, loyalty was no longer guaranteed. But none of that mattered more than the fact that Evelyn was carrying his child, a child that instantly became the most valuable secret in the criminal underworld. Dominic began to search himself, using every resource at his disposal. Airport surveillance was reviewed within hours. Bus terminals were locked into rotation checks. False identities were flagged across state databases. Hospitals were contacted through silent channels. Informant were activated in cities Evelyn had never even mentioned. Yet the search carried a strange limitation. The pregnancy remained hidden from most of his men, not out of trust, but out of necessity. The fewer people who knew, the fewer who could use it. Miles away, Evelyn sat under a new identity, Claire Bennett, in a small Oregon town where the air smelled like rain and with smoke instead of steel and power. She walked through quiet streets, unaware of how large the world behind her still reached. Dominic eventually found one irregularity. A bus ticket purchased under a false name matching Evelyn's escape route. But something about it was wrong. The payment method did not align with her habits. The timing suggested external access. The purchase felt too clean, too assisted. Dominic stared at the report longer than he should have, his mind connecting patterns he did not want to accept. Because for the first time, the possibility emerged that Evelyn had not escaped alone. Someone inside his world had helped her vanish, and that person was still close enough to touch his empire without warning. Evelyn Cross believed distance could create safety. In a small Oregon town wrapped in fog and silence, she tried to rebuild a life that no longer belonged to Dominic Vale's world. But danger rarely needed loud entrances. Sometimes it arrived quietly, disguised as routine kindness or curiosity. She now lived under the name Claire Bennett, identity carefully chosen to leave no trace of the woman who once stood inside a Mafia empire. Her new home was a narrow room above a closed bookstore, where the floor creaked at night, and the wind pressed softly against the windows like an unseen witness. Days followed a fragile rhythm. She worked mornings at a small bakery where the smell of bread masked the weight of fear she carried. Evenings were spent counting money, checking locks, and planning exits she hoped she would never need. The town looked peaceful on the surface. Wooden houses lined quiet streets. Mountain roads disappeared into mist. Strangers smiled too easily, asked too many questions, and remembered details that no one should notice. Inside that calm, Evelyn's life remained unstable. She visited a local clinic under strict caution, avoiding insurance records and refusing emergency contacts. Dr. Hannah Pierce, the town physician, noticed immediately that Claire Bennett did not behave like an ordinary patient. There was hesitation in every answer, tension in every breath, and fear that surfaced whenever the baby's father was mentioned. Hannah did not press too hard, but she remembered everything. At the diner across town, Mason Reed became another constant presence. He was attentive in a way that felt both comforting and slightly misplaced. Extra meals appeared without charge. Conversations lingered longer than necessary. His concern looked genuine, yet certain pauses in his gaze suggested observation rather than kindness alone. Evelyn told herself she was being paranoid. That was easier than admitting she no longer knew how to distinguish safety from strategy. Still, Memories of Dominic refused to fade. They arrived without warning. In the scent of rain, in the silence of empty rooms, in the way some men on the street stood too still. She remembered the rare moments when Dominic Vale was not an empire, but a man watching the world from behind glass, carrying exhaustion he never admitted. Those memories hurt more than the violence she had fled, because they reminded her that love had once existed inside the danger. Then the fractures in her new life began to widen. A black SUV passed through town twice in 1 week, always too slow, always too clean. A stranger at the gas station asked about Chicago before correcting himself and walking away. A phone call once came through an unknown number, but the moment Evelyn answered, it ended in silence. Each incident alone meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern she could not ignore. One afternoon, she received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a photograph of Dominic Vale standing outside his mansion, his posture different from before, less controlled, more broken. On the back, a single line warned her that leaving Dominic did not mean leaving the consequences of his world. That night, Evelyn sat in the darkness of her small room, realizing something unsettling. She had not escaped attention. She had only changed who might be watching. For the first time, she considered leaving again. But pregnancy had turned movement into risk, and exhaustion had turned escape into uncertainty. The thought of starting over once more felt impossible. Hours later, she returned to her room after work and froze at the sight waiting for her. A tiny pair of baby shoes rested neatly on her bed, and beside them lay a folded note that suggested Dominic Vale was not the only man who wanted her child. The most dangerous threat to Evelyn Cross was no longer the man she ran from. It was a man who understood what her silence was worth before she ever spoke a word. In a high-rise office overlooking another city skyline, Vincent Moretti studied information the way others studied religion. He was not loud, not impulsive, not emotional. His power came from patience, from waiting, from knowing exactly when a secret would become valuable enough to move. Dominic Vale's empire was built on fear. Vincent Moretti's strategy was built on timing. And Evelyn Cross had become perfect timing. He understood something others missed. A child born into Dominic Vale's bloodline was not just legacy. It was leverage, a future negotiation, a weapon that could bend entire territories without a single shot being fired. Long before Evelyn disappeared from the mansion, Vincent had already been watching. Not the streets, not the businesses, the house itself, a bribed nurse, a compromised file. A single overlooked medical record had told him everything he needed to know long before Dominic even suspected the truth. Secrecy had never belonged to Evelyn. It had belonged to whoever was already listening. Back in Chicago, Dominic Vale moved through his inner circle like a storm that refused to break. Every answer he received created more questions. Roman Slate stood closest, as always, controlled, precise, too steady for a man in the middle of chaos. That steadiness began to feel wrong. Dominic noticed small things now. Delayed reactions, carefully chosen silence, a refusal to meet certain questions directly. Roman knew more than he was saying, or worse, he knew exactly how much to hide. When Dominic discovered that Evelyn's medical records had been accessed through a private clinic tied indirectly to Moretti's financial network, the shape of the truth began to form. This was no longer just escape. It was extraction. And somewhere inside that extraction, betrayal had been present before Evelyn ever made her choice. Dominic's anger did not explode outward. It compressed inward. The empire he built suddenly felt less like protection and more like a structure that had quietly failed the one person he never meant to lose. Evelyn, meanwhile, tried to reach beyond silence. She attempted anonymous reports, indirect contacts, anything that might create distance between her and the growing pressure around her life. But every attempt led to the same realization. Names like Vale and Moretti did not exist in systems designed to protect people. They existed outside them. Law enforcement was not an option. It was an illusion. At the diner, Mason Reed offered to take her farther north, somewhere even quieter, somewhere safer. His timing was too precise, his concern too steady. Evelyn could no longer tell if he was protection or placement. Another piece moved across a board she never agreed to play on. Dr. Hannah Pierce became more direct. Stress was no longer a warning. It was a medical risk. Evelyn was carrying life in a body trapped between fear and exhaustion, and every choice was now doubled in consequence. Then came the moment that shattered whatever illusion of safety remained. At a gas station on the edge of town, Evelyn saw a man standing near the pumps, still, observant, unmistakably familiar in the wrong way. Someone from Dominic's world. Not a memory, not imagination. Real. She hid before he could look her way. When she checked again, he was gone. No confrontation. No message. Only absence. That absence was worse than confirmation, because it meant she was being watched by more than one side. Evelyn returned to her room that night, with a realization forming slowly, painfully. Escape had stopped being enough. She needed answers. She needed context. She needed to understand who was moving her life without her consent. And there was only one place left to look. Buried contacts, hidden messages, an emergency device she had sworn never to activate again. She made the call. The phone rang once, twice, before a voice answered, calm, familiar, and already too informed. Roman Slate. And in the same breath he spoke next, he revealed he already knew exactly where she was standing. Evelyn Cross believed danger had a predictable shape. Black cars, armed men, and the weight of Dominic Vale's world pressing in from a distance. But the truth was far more unsettling. The deepest betrayal does not arrive with violence. It arrives with trust already built. Roman Slate had always been close enough to Dominic Vale to understand everything, and far enough to act without immediate suspicion. That balance was not loyalty. It was control waiting for the right moment to surface. On the other end of the call, his voice carried calm certainty, the kind that did not ask permission to enter someone's fear. He spoke about Dominic not as a leader, but as a collapsing structure, an empire losing grip, a man distracted by emotion and exposed weakness. Then he turned the conversation toward Evelyn. He positioned himself as the only stable point in a collapsing system, the only person who could keep her and the unborn child from becoming collateral in a war that was already forming between Dominic Vale and Vincent Moretti. What Evelyn did not immediately understand was that every word Roman spoke was not protection. It was framing. He was not explaining danger. He was defining her placement inside it. Slowly, the truth unraveled. Roman did not deny involvement in her disappearance. He confirmed it. He had not simply observed her escape. He had influenced it, guided it, made sure Dominic saw it as abandonment rather than extraction. Because a broken Dominic Vale was easier to destabilize than a controlled one. Evelyn was not a fugitive. She was a calculated absence, a tool, a trigger point waiting to be used. The emotional weight of that realization pressed harder than fear, because it meant Dominic might have spent every sleepless night believing she left him willingly, when in reality she had been moved like an object between competing strategies. Roman's plan became clearer in fragments. He intended to push Evelyn toward Vincent Moretti's reach, forcing Dominic into emotional collapse and territorial war. Once both sides weakened, Roman would step into the vacuum left behind and take control of what remained of the Vale Empire. Even kindness had been engineered. Mason Reed was not a bystander. He was part of the structure. The diner, the bookstore room, the quiet streets of Oregon, all of it had been chosen because it felt safe enough to delay suspicion. A cage designed to feel like shelter. Evelyn understood then that she had never truly escaped Dominic Vale's world. She had only been relocated within it. Every exit she had taken had already been anticipated. At Dr. Hannah Pierce's clinic, that realization finally cracked into action. Hannah noticed a change in Evelyn immediately, not just fear but clarity, a dangerous kind of understanding that left no room for hesitation. Without asking questions she could not afford and no answers to, Hannah guided her through a back exit during a routine check, giving her a narrow opening to disappear into the storm outside. Rain hit hard as Evelyn ran, each step feeling like a decision rather than an escape. Pregnant, exhausted, and shaken, she refused to become a possession in a conflict she never chose. Every breath carried the same silent refusal. Her child would not be currency. Meanwhile, in Chicago, Dominic Vale finally uncovered what Roman had hidden. Altered security logs, rewritten timestamps, carefully erased movements from the night Evelyn vanished. patterns that did not belong to chaos, but to intention. For the first time, Dominic stopped reacting and started deciding. His empire was no longer something to protect. It was something that had been used against him. And when he traced the final fragment of Roman's manipulation, it led him to a hidden route map marking a quiet town in Oregon. Without hesitation, he prepared to move. But as Dominic crossed into action, Roman was already one step ahead again, arriving at Evelyn's location with men who were not there to retrieve anything, but to ensure nothing survived to testify. When Dominic Vale finally found Evelyn Cross, it was not like the endings people imagined in stories of lost love. There was no surrender, no relief, no running into safety. She stood inside the ruined silence of an old church basement, holding a broken piece of glass like it was the only boundary separating her from everything that had ever tried to control her. Outside, the storm had returned with force. Black cars cut through rain-soaked roads. Headlights flickered across empty trees. Men moved in disciplined formation through the darkness, not speaking, not hesitating. Roman slates people, trained for precision rather than mercy. Evelyn's breathing stayed controlled, but her posture told the truth. She was not waiting to be saved. She was ready to defend what mattered more than her own survival. Then Dominic Vale arrived. He did not enter loudly. Power never needed volume. His presence shifted the atmosphere before anyone saw him. Roman's men hesitated for a fraction of a second too long, and that was enough. What followed was not chaos. It was collapse. Roman's operation fractured under Dominic's arrival, not because of violence alone, but because authority had changed hands in an instant. The balance of control broke, and with it, the plan that had been tightening around Evelyn for weeks. But Dominic did not move toward dominance. He moved toward her, and when he saw her clearly, everything else stopped mattering. Evelyn did not run into his arms. She stepped back, because the man who had just disrupted an attack was also the man whose world had forced her to run in the first place. The same power that protected her was a power she feared returning to. Dominic saw it immediately. He saw her condition. The pregnancy was no longer a secret hidden by distance or silence. It was real, visible, undeniable. And in that moment, something in Dominic Vale broke without sound. Not rage, not denial, recognition. He had lost time, months that belonged to a child he had not known existed. Evelyn's truth came without accusation. She had not left out of hatred. She had left because survival had demanded distance. In Dominic's world, love never existed without surveillance, and safety never existed without ownership. Dominic did not defend himself. He did not argue. The silence between them carried more truth than words ever could. He understood now that his empire had never been separate from their separation. It had created it. Roman disappeared during the chaos, slipping away like someone who had already prepared for failure. His absence was not escape. It was continuation. Dominic offered protection. Evelyn refused control, disguised as protection. She would not return to Chicago as a hidden secret inside his world. If she was to survive, it had to be on terms that did not erase her identity or her child's future. For the first time, Dominic faced a choice that could not be solved through power. He could preserve his empire or preserve them, not both. The danger outside the church did not fade. Vincent Moretti's network had already begun tightening its movement toward their position, responding to instability with opportunity. Evelyn eventually agreed to leave with Dominic, but only under strict conditions she set with quiet firmness. No mansion, no guard surrounding her life, no return to the system that had made escape necessary in the first place. Dominic brought her to a remote safe house in Montana, hidden deep within snow-covered forests where silence fell heavier than surveillance ever had. No city noise, no empire, only distance. Inside that isolation, Dominic began destroying parts of his own world. Documents burned quietly in a stone fireplace. Records of operations reduced to ash. Each page represented a piece of power he was willingly releasing. Evelyn watched from across the room, unable to decide whether she was witnessing love finally taking form, or another version of control learning how to disguise itself as sacrifice. That uncertainty stayed with her longer than the snow outside. And just when the fragile possibility of survival began to feel real, Dominic's phone lit up with a single message, An image of Roman Slate standing outside Dr. Hannah Pierce's clinic, blood visible on his sleeve, as if the war had already moved somewhere neither of them could reach in time. Dominic Vale finally understood something that years of power had never taught him. Being feared by an entire city meant nothing if the woman carrying his child still had to live like she was running from him. The message about Dr. Hannah Pierce changed everything. Roman Slate had taken her, not as collateral, but as pressure, a reminder that even kindness inside this war had consequences. Hannah's only crime was helping Evelyn survive, and now she had become leverage in a game she never agreed to play. Evelyn did not break, but something inside her tightened. Fear had never been her strongest reaction. Responsibility was. She refused to allow an innocent woman to suffer because of choices made by men who treated lives like strategies. Dominic wanted her to stay hidden, protected, removed from risk. But Evelyn's refusal was absolute. Safety that required someone else's pain was not safety. It was continuation of the same system she had escaped. That was the moment the fracture became permanent. Vincent Moretti and Roman Slate were no longer separate threats. They were beginning to overlap, not as allies in trust, but as converging interests. Roman wanted control of Dominic's empire. Vincent wanted Dominic's bloodline as leverage to reshape the balance of power. Neither fully trusted the other, and that instability created something dangerous. Opportunity. Dominic recognized it immediately, and for the first time, he stopped thinking like a ruler. He started thinking like a man preparing to lose everything. The decision did not come with hesitation. It came with clarity. Dominic began constructing a plan that would dismantle his own protection network from the inside. Evidence of illegal operations, financial trails, coded transactions, all of it prepared for federal exposure. It was not surrender. It was redirection. If his empire could be used as a weapon against Evelyn's survival, then it had to fall before it could be used again. Evelyn watched him as the plan formed, reading intention through action rather than words. She did not trust transformation easily. Pain had taught her that change inside men like Dominic often came with hidden costs. But what she saw now was not performance. It was erosion. Dominic recorded a full confession, structured not for redemption, but protection. It named Roman Slate as the internal catalyst of betrayal, documenting how manipulation had turned Evelyn's pregnancy into a trigger for war. It ensured that if anything happened to her, the system would not erase what had been done. At its core, something deeper was forming in him. Not redemption, not guilt, a refusal to repeat what raised him. Dominic Vale had been shaped by violence, trained by fear, and built through control. But the child Evelyn carried represented something that did not belong to that cycle. And for the first time, he chose to break it instead of continue it. The confrontation was set in an abandoned rail yard outside Billings, Montana. Snow fell over rusted train cars like silence trying to bury history. Floodlights cut through the cold air. Armed figures moved between shadows, waiting for an outcome that no one fully controlled. Dr. Hannah Pierce was found alive, shaken but breathing, confirming that Roman's message had not been symbolic. It was active pressure. Evelyn remained hidden within the structure of the rail yard, but Roman already understood her pattern. Compassion. That was what he counted on, not fear, and it worked. He cornered her in a narrow space between steel and snow, making it clear that the child she carried was no longer just a secret. It was currency, something worth more than territory, more than loyalty, more than survival. Then Dominic arrived, but instead of escalating into destruction, he revealed something that changed the shape of the entire battlefield. Federal agents were already closing in. His evidence had already been activated. The system he once controlled was now collapsing around all of them. Roman realized too late that Dominic had not come to win. He had come to end the board entirely. As sirens tightened around the rail yard, cutting through the snowfall like inevitability, the shadows shifted again, and from the edge of the darkness, Vincent Moretti stepped forward holding a final piece of truth. Proof that the attack on Evelyn had not begun with Roman, but with someone inside Dominic Vale's own bloodline, long before she ever tried to escape. Evelyn Cross believed the war had reached its end in the frozen silence of the rail yard, but she was wrong. The final truth was not waiting outside in the snow or in the hands of Dominic Vale's enemies. It had always been buried closer, inside the very bloodline that built his empire. Vincent Moretti stepped forward with something he had guarded more carefully than weapons. Information, not speculation, not manipulation, but origin. A truth that rewrote everything Dominic Vale believed about loyalty, family, and betrayal. Dominic's uncle, Alden Vale, had been the silent architect behind Evelyn's suffering. Not Vincent, not Roman alone. Alden had feared what love would do to Dominic's focus, what a child would do to control. In his eyes, weakness was not emotional, it was structural. So he had ordered pressure, threats, and silent interference meant to remove Evelyn before she could shift the balance of power. The realization fractured Dominic more deeply than any war ever could, because it meant the danger had never been external alone. It had lived inside the house he called family. The same blood that built the Vale Empire had also tried to erase his future child before it could exist as more than a possibility. For the first time, Dominic Vale looked less like a ruler and more like a man standing in the ruins of inherited belief. The rail yard erupted into controlled collapse. Federal agents tightened their perimeter as evidence chains activated across multiple jurisdictions. Roman attempted escape, moving through the chaos with calculated speed, but there was no clean exit left. Vincent tried to use the confusion to reposition himself, but power no longer flowed in predictable directions. Everything was breaking at once. Dominic did not run. He stayed long enough to ensure the evidence he surrendered was fully received. That single act sealed the fall of the Vale organization, not through violence, but exposure. A system that had survived fear for decades finally collapsed under truth. Roman was detained before he could disappear. Vincent's leverage dissolved as agencies closed in from all sides. Neither man walked away clean, and neither narrative survived unchanged. Dominic Vale did not escape consequence. His empire collapsed into investigation, seizure, and public unraveling. The name that once commanded obedience became a case file. Power did not protect him anymore. It isolated him. Evelyn watched all of it unfold from a distance that no longer felt like exile. Her final choice was not about forgiveness. It was about definition. She refused to let fear become the architecture of her child's life. The past had been built on control, and she would not rebuild it in a softer shape. She did not deny Dominic access to redemption, but she denied the world access to her daughter's future. In the months that followed, Evelyn gave birth far from Chicago, in a quiet hospital where no sirens followed and no names carried weight. A baby girl entered the world, named Clara Vale Cross, a name that carried inheritance and independence in equal measure. Dominic was allowed to visit under strict conditions. No guards, no presence of empire, no control hidden behind protection. Only time, silence, and accountability. He learned to hold his daughter, without owning the moment, as if learning a language he had never been taught. Evelyn built her life again from simplicity. A small bookstore, steady mornings, a future shaped by choice instead of survival. She was no longer running. She was living. Dominic's transformation remained incomplete, but real. He could not undo what he had built, but he could refuse to pass it forward. For a time, peace existed, not perfect, but earned. Then one evening, Evelyn received a sealed envelope with no return address. Inside was a photograph of Dominic's mother holding an infant, and a note suggesting that Dominic Vale was not the final surviving heir of the Vale bloodline. Evelyn looked toward her sleeping daughter, and for the first time since escaping the mansion, understood that the story had not ended. It had only changed direction.